Welcome to the spring of the year 2031. I look out of my window, I was going to say, but instead up and through the skylight, and I see a clear March sky. The latest storm has blown through, and the forecasters say the jet stream is retreating north, and I think we can begin to see an end to this latest exhausting winter. I only hope we don't have another punishing, arid summer to come. It's safe to say that our new climate is definitely not to our taste. But we are where we are, and it's the case that really we have to talk about the weather. Not just because it's what we do in Ireland, we talk about the weather, but because the weather has been talking to us insistently in these last years and moving us in directions that might once have felt startling and at speeds that might once have taken our breath away. In short, the weather has played its part in changing this island, our systems, our future. The weather has put it up to us, as the saying goes, and we've had no choice but to respond. I'll come back to the weather in a moment. For now, though, let's take stock. Let's look around at this new Ireland, this new unitary state with a twist, the form of which has evolved with startling speed. And let's remember how all this change came to pass. And of course, we have to go back to what we now call year zero, to the Brexit referendum of 2016, when everything began to change and continue to change. We all knew, of course, everybody knew, that from the UK's decision to leave the European Union, whatever leaving meant, would flow all manner of change. That was obvious. I think, though, that the sheer vastness of the change coming down the line, this only became clear as the supplementary choices came in one by one. The UK government's choice of the hardest possible Brexit, the premiership of Boris Johnson, the UK's effective exit from the EU at Christmas 2020, each of which proving to be factors that increased the intensity of the centrifugal pressures within the United Kingdom. And then the signing of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which established the UK internal border. The 2021 elections in Scotland, which brought about a majority SNP government. The agreement, after much sparring and quarrelling, that Scotland would stage a fresh independence referendum in 2024, and the pro-independence vote which followed, leading in 2027 to an independent Scotland within the European Union, and of course to an end of a recognisable United Kingdom after 300 years and more. I itemised such a list, and of course I could add many more entries to it, because it's useful, I think, to remember just how astonishing each entry actually is. I was in my mid-40s in 2016, meaning that I remember very well the negotiations that resulted in the Good Friday Agreement, and the strong sense commonly held that because of the agreement, and in spite of the sturm und drang of Northern Ireland politics, the Union was more secure than it had ever been. The majority of people in Northern Ireland wanted economic stability, wanted a measure of security for themselves and their families, wanted, regardless of their politics, a sense of a secure future. The intricacies of the Good Friday Agreement did not entirely please anybody, but they allowed voters to feel that their identities were being more or less respected, that the Union was secure, while an all-Ireland dimension to life in Northern Ireland was being acknowledged. There were challenges and clouds on the horizon. The architecture of the agreement, the baked-in sectarian model, was increasingly seen as a problem that would have to be fixed eventually, gradually, in some unknown way, but sure, something would be worked out. The other problem, a long-standing Conservative Party culture of contempt towards and ignorance of Ireland, well, this was a worry too, but hopefully nothing will come of it. But then, as I say, came Brexit. 15 years later, I confess my mind still boggles at the Brexit decisions made by the DUP. Do you remember the DUP? It's gone now, of course, it's vaporised, it's imploded. Okay, so the party never thought the vote would pass. I think we all get that. DUP politicians could grandstand and salute their Britishness and broadcast anti-EU sentiment, secure in the knowledge that nothing would actually change. You might ask, yes, but why not just play it safe? Why not just keep their heads down? Why go for the easy option? Why not simply sidestep all possibility of peril? These are questions for another day. What I think is clear is that the DUP then went on to misplay every card in its hand, year after year, hand after hand, misplayed. The psychologists would have a field day with the DUP and its collective attitude to its British identity and its relationship with the Conservative Party, a classic abusive relationship, and the DUP couldn't get enough of it. In stark electoral terms, of course, the voters were meanwhile moving on. And it seems to me that this is one of the most significant stories of these past years. We all remember, I remember the prognostications of the pundits, the opinions handed down on tablets of stone over the years, those columns which declared that the Northern Ireland electorate, so siloed as it was incapable of voting outside the box, was incapable of imagining new electoral formations. To be sure, the headline event of the 2022 Assembly elections in Northern Ireland was the emergence of Sinn Féin as the largest party and the installation of a Sinn Féin First Minister. But of equal interest, and as it turned out much greater long-term significance, was the continued growth of the middle ground, the consolidation of a new constituency of voters who were not tied to those fixed identities, who were open to a range of possible futures. And even more pertinent to that future, a swelling in the number of young people, young voters hungry for different models, different ways of imagining society. And then, as I say, Scotland and English nationalism. And then the famous declaration stated loudly by a quorum of backbench Conservative Party MPs that Northern Ireland was an expensive nuisance that was best discarded, that something would have to be done. The continuing difficulties of a shrinking post-Brexit British economy, the understanding that the UK as an entity was on the way out. Another list, another itemisation, which ends, of course, with the Irish border poll of 2026. And an Irish border poll that was conducted against the backdrop not only of a Northern Ireland with a Sinn Féin First Minister in Belfast, but of other, and in the event, much more momentous happenings. And this is where the weather comes in again as the most decisive factor of all. Because after all, who can possibly forget the environmental ravages and catastrophes of this period in the middle of the decade? The flooding of Cork city centre on Christmas Eve 2024 was a true catastrophe. Yet even in the face of such destruction, there seemed no appetite for a fundamental political rethink on the question of climate policy. But as 2024 ended and the new year began, it soon became apparent that the Atlantic conveyor belt of storms was locked in a calamitous sequence. Cork was flooded again and again, and so was Galway and many smaller towns. Beaches and golf courses were washed away, and livelihoods with them. And then in the late spring of 2025, an event took place that had long been foretold. Spring tides and a full moon coincided with a low pressure system over Rockall and pushed a wall of water into the Irish Sea, flooding Belfast and Dublin and causing destruction on an unmanageable scale. In that same spring, torrential rainfall in the stripped bare Irish uplands caused rivers across the bank to burst their banks, flooding farmland, towns and suburbs alike. Now, It was no longer possible to deny the ongoing climate emergency. No longer possible either to imagine or to justify two separate jurisdictions on one small island. And this realization and the urgency of the situation changed everything. And there was another reason why, as the border poll approached, the surveys consistently indicated a solid majority for unification. Call it the human factor, the factor that had always been undermeasured and underappreciated by politicians and pundits of all stripes. The sense that many everyday lives and experiences had always been lived on an all-island basis, that a melding into one simply made a good deal of sense. The agriculture sector had long been accustomed to an all-Ireland economy. So too had many sports, from the GAA to rugby to golf. So had the hospitality and tourism sector. Human connections had been forged across the border, and pre-existing connections had always stretched without breaking across the border. Trade unions and professional organisations alike were comfortable with the idea too. In fact, the more one looked, the more it became clear that opposition to the notion of unification emanated from a range of vested interests. And the more it became clear too that these vested interests did not have the numbers to stop this sea change. The climate emergency was simply too pressing. John Hume noted long ago that the real division of Ireland is not a line drawn on a map, but in the minds and hearts of its people. And as it turned out, a changing and challenging world meant that this division could be set aside, could be healed for the greater good. And so the border poll, which in theory should have precipitated high political drama and tension, in fact passed. It passed handily. The question was then, what's next? Who decides? And how would these decisions be made? This last question, as it turned out, was answered easily enough. The politicians, north and south, they didn't want the job. It was too difficult. And besides, they weren't sufficiently trusted. Instead, the task of drafting up future paradigms, structures, systems was handed over to the citizens' conventions, which, as most people agreed, had made a good, crisp job of the abortion and marriage equality debates of the previous decade. Most people agreed, but certainly not all. Certain pressure groups, columnists, lobbyists, institutes, fearful of what the citizens' conventions might come up with, loudly criticised such a decision-making route. These interest groups mobilised in defence of the status quo. In the Republic, earnest newspaper columns declared that the very notion of unification was fanciful and the costs insupportable. In the North, former First Minister Arlene Foster, now Baroness Dernewilt, repeated her threat to leave the island if unification became a reality. But the die was cast, and the conventions began their deliberations. Each convention, you will recall, explored its own strands, so politics and administration, the constitution, the environment, health, education. But there was an overarching intent to their deliberations, which was to create the best possible society, to bring together the best aspects of both parts of Ireland and to discard the worst. What form would this new unitary Ireland take? What would change? What would stay the same? What best bits, as people like to say, from north and south would be retained? And what worst bits would be jettisoned for good? It soon became clear that for the conventions, the sky was the limit. No wonder that lobbyists and institutes were alarmed at what might be coming down the line at them. Let's recall some of the ideas adopted by the conventions and that now, in the year 2031, have been adopted into law. As a northerner living in the Republic, I recall my wry amusement in observing the realization that unification definitely did not mean absorption of the North by the South, that the German paradigm would simply not work in Ireland. Yes, it came as a shock to many voters in the Republic to realise that there was much about life in the North that was worth retaining. This was nowhere better expressed than in the form of the National Health Service. As a child of the NHS myself, born and raised in nationalist Derry, I was always aware of the historical and political ironies. The NHS was a great achievement of the post-war British state, and here was nationalist Derry as emotionally bound to the institution as any other corner of the United Kingdom. The NHS logo was even proudly emblazoned on Free Derry Corner. But of course it was. It exemplified the dream of a just society, and it showed that a just society need not be merely a dream. So, no, there could be no question of forcing or entreating citizens of Northern Ireland to abandon the NHS and its essential principles in favour of the systemically unfair healthcare system south of the border. No question of obliging Northern citizens to begin forking out 60 quid every time they wanted to visit their GP. No. An NHS-style system would be rolled out across the country. Private healthcare forces were faced down, doctors' organisations were paid off and strong-armed into compliance, the Taoiseach repeating Aniran Bevan's remark that the doctors' mouths would be stuffed with gold. The Republic's private hospitals were nationalised, and no, the sky did not fall down. And with education, the convention looked at the patchwork of secondary and grammar and controlled and maintained and integrated schools, which operated north of the border, and said no more. It looked at the labyrinth of school networks and patronages south of the border, where the state paid for education without necessarily being in control of its delivery, and said no more. And so was born Ireland's new National Schools Authority, which took the principle of single-tier, secular, comprehensive education, exalted it, and rolled it out across Ireland to the relief of the vast majority of parents. The churches screamed blue murder, of course, and so did private and fee-paying schools in the Republic, now stripped of state support and invited to join the new national system. And the grammar schools in the north, now grammar schools no longer. But the public was behind these radical educational changes, and they worked. As for the new national planning system, created to integrate policy on housing, transport, environmental diversity, and more, it was designed to respond to the climate emergency and to begin painstakingly to put right the planning errors of the past. It prioritised the building of homes by the state, green homes to passive house standards, affordable homes in the places where people actually needed them. It mandated the planting of upland trees by the million to begin to address the growing scourge of flooding and to remove the monocultures of spruce plantations which had impoverished the landscape and led to destructive bog slides and water pollution across the country. Its mantra of working with the water chimed now with the public mood, and the effects of its policies were rapid and transformational. Most of all, Ireland's new radically decentralised system of administration carried the public with it. For this was a population jaded by the status quo, by rising social inequality, by the creaking structures and flat-footed responses of two equally, chronically over-centralised states, and jolted now by a chain of natural disasters into embracing the deep structural changes that were being proposed. With real powers of governance devolved to the regions, there was a sense of popular excitement at the prospect of a federal system of government that returned power to local level and relocated thousands of jobs from Dublin and Belfast, and of the possibilities afforded by the radical green energy schemes being rolled out nationwide. And indeed, a radically green Ireland is evolving, with green policies understood now not to be a fad, but a social and environmental imperative. I've mentioned the planting of upland trees, and rewilding in general is changing the face of our landscape. Rivers are being returned to nature to stop floods before they start. Floodplains are being restored, with their inhabitants compensated and rehoused. The corncrake is back in the Shannon Callows and in the new Lough Erne National Park. Oh, and this really is the new golden age of the railway. Other factors also help to sell the notion of an Ireland transformed, an Ireland of the future. Generous EU structural funds were made available, and of course the notion of austerity had been ditched once and for all. In Ireland, as elsewhere in the aftermath of the COVID economic catastrophe, in favour of a return to Keynesian models of deep borrowing and long-term infrastructural spending. The universal income scheme has been working pretty well, pretty smoothly. Oh, and it turned out that it was possible to eliminate homelessness. Finland had already demonstrated as much, and Ireland's new constitutionally guaranteed right to a home proved as much again. And our innovative Irish process of evolution and development has caught the attention of the world. Was this to be a new Second Republic, a new springtime of peoples? These terms were indeed bandied about by the pundits, alongside references to the 1848 year of revolutions. Indeed, the phrase Second Republic even made it into the preamble to the new draft Irish Constitution, until historians observed that the French Second Republic of 1848 had lasted a mere 3 years. The label was dropped hastily. And as a result of all the attention, tourism boomed, with German visitors in particular eager to see how the Irish did it being unification and all that flowed from it. And as you know, the new All-Ireland coastal footpath and the Malin to Mizen Greenway have basked in global acclaim. Of course, not everybody has been happy. There are no fairy tale endings in this real world. Baroness Dernewilt, for instance, she made good on her promise to leave should a united Ireland come about. It's worth mentioning, though, that she was back within 6 months. Eastbourne, it turned out, didn't suit for a number of reasons. The south of England is far too hot nowadays. And besides, people kept asking her when she was going home. And now she's back to being plain old Arlene again, for there are no peerages in the new Ireland. For this northerner, it's strange to look at our new maps in which Northern Ireland has vanished as though it had never existed. But even the unhappy could ultimately appreciate the way the cards fell. For this altered dispensation, this radically different Ireland, has placed the Northern Party, one of a number of new political parties that have forever altered the shape of Irish politics, at the centre of parliamentary arithmetic, and set to hold the balance of power in Dublin for the foreseeable future. As many have reflected, what an irony. The United Nations speculates, tentatively, that humanity might have moved in the nick of time to stem the worst effects of the climate crisis. We might survive after all, so they say. I don't know about that. I think of the weather again, of the winter just past, of the summer still to come. But it's fair to say that we've changed and are changing our systems in Ireland in order to face this future, whatever it brings, head on. It took all our collective guts to do so. And I hope it's enough.